Welcome to KNN. KNN is brought to you by Bob Knakal, Chairman of New York Investment Sales at JLL.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Hageman, Managing Director at JLL. Welcome to KNN. Today I'm here with Bob Knakal, Chairman of New York Investment Sales, and today we're going to talk about commercial rent control. So Bob, one of our frequent topics on KNN is recent legislation issues that have arisen. Today we're going to talk about commercial rent control. I bet I already know how you feel about this, but why don't you tell us a little bit about its background?
Yeah, Hags, I have to say, governments have been trying to set prices or fix prices for centuries. In fact, you go back to the Old Testament, there was restriction on interest on loans. Medieval governments capped the price of bread. And recently in the United States, we've seen price fixing on gasoline, that we have a minimum wage. We have rent regulation here in New York that fixes rents. So this is not something
for another day.
That's right, topic for another day. It's not a new thing, but recently, about a year ago, legislators here in New York proposed commercial rent control to provide, in theory, protection for tenants who have leases expiring.
When we talk about these legislation issues, you often bring up a misallocation of resources. Tell us what you mean by that as it relates to commercial rent control.
Well, revert back to the famous economist Milton Friedman, who once said, economists don't know a lot, but they know how to create shortages and excesses. And what happens when you artificially fix pricing, whether you fix prices artificially low or fix them artificially high, it does have a significant impact on the market, and you get people behaving in ways that they wouldn't otherwise behave in. When you talk about misallocation of resources, let's look at something that's near and dear to our heart, Hags, and that's the rent regulation here in New York.
Sure.
Because rents are artificially kept low, that creates inertia amongst residents in apartments, and so they don't leave. And the misallocation I'm referring to is when you have an elderly widow living in a 4-bedroom apartment by herself, or a family of 5 sharing a 1-bedroom apartment. Those types of misallocations happen because of the incentive to stay because of the lower rent.
Sure.
So that's the misallocation that I'm talking about. And that same type of dynamic could happen if this commercial rent control gets instituted here in New York.
Commercial rent control, this is not a new concept. This is something that I've even heard of in my past decade and a half before. But how long has this been discussed for?
New York actually had commercial rent control back from 45 to 1963 because of the war. This came out of a wartime thing. But that was something that was controlled by the state, not by the city. Okay. And I remember when I first got into the business in '84, shortly thereafter, Ruth Messenger was championing bringing commercial rent control back in 1986. And it was a very hot topic again in 2009. There was commercial rent control proposed then. The interesting thing is that now, with the results of the elections that we had last November, it's thought that more radical types of legislation actually have a chance of passing. There are some people that think it might have a chance, maybe not in the current form that it was introduced in, but maybe in a modified form, because the balance of power in Albany has shifted. The balance of power in the city is much further left-leaning than it's been in the past. So some folks in the marketplace are concerned that it may actually have some traction this time.
Why don't we talk about some of the specifics of the bill that's been proposed?
Right. Well, Intro 737 says that a commercial tenant, or actually any non-residential tenant, shall have the right to a 10-year renewal lease on their space and must be offered that renewal lease 180 days prior to the expiration of their lease. If the landlord and the tenant don't agree, there is going to be a forced mediation or binding arbitration that will settle the dispute.
So in the event of this binding arbitration, what happens after that?
Well, if the property owner doesn't like the result of the arbitration, it's too bad. If the tenant doesn't like the result, they can opt for a 10% increase over the last year's rent. And if the landlord won't accept that 10% increase, they have the ability to go out to the marketplace and get a third-party tenant to make an offer. But then the old tenant has a first right of refusal to take the lease at that level.
So, Bob, how is this supposed to help the tenants?
Well, the theory is that the tenants can stay in possession, but really, if you look at this dynamic, it doesn't really pencil out. Mainly because if the owner is happy with the tenant and goes to them with an amount for a renewal that
Right.
they believe is the market, if they go through this whole process and go out and get a third-party tenant to make a market bid, the tenant has the right to match that bid. So theoretically, it doesn't stop something. If the rent had doubled during the course of that tenant's tenancy, they're going to have to pay double anyway. The problem comes into play that when you have this first right of refusal mechanism, what tenant is going to go and negotiate and sign a new lease and go through that process and that expense, the time, when the tenant can just exercise their first right and get the space?
So, Bob, another thing you always mention when we talk about these legislative issues is the unintended consequences as a result of them. So why don't you tell us what you believe to be some of those unintended consequences for CRC?
Right, well, there are a couple. One is that tenants that occupy millions of square feet could potentially benefit from this. Secondly, I think it's going to make it a lot harder for startup companies and companies that aren't well established to get space in the first place, because then an owner could be stuck with a tenant that they don't necessarily want to have in their building. And also, to the extent that an owner can go out and get a free market tenant to make a market bid, that tenant's going to have to pay market rent anyway. So there are a number of things that don't quite make sense here. I think it would be very significant in terms of the jobs that it reduces for building out new spaces for tenants. That probably will exert downward pressure on total rents, which will exert downward pressure on real estate taxes. Most of these legislative things, if you look at them through the prism of jobs and real estate taxes, you look at them a little differently. So I think that the impetus for this is misguided. I don't see it working or working to anyone's benefit, and I think that it'll be interesting to see how it pans out, and if it gets any traction. The industry hopes that it doesn't, but we'll see what happens. You never know today.